11 o'clock at night, September 2, 1944. A two-lane French highway south of Chartres, 90 kilometers southwest of Paris. There is no moon. The blackout rules are absolute. A convoy of 40 GMC 2.5-ton trucks is moving east at 25 miles per hour, each truck separated from the one ahead by exactly 60 yards, each one navigating by the faint glow of two small slotted lamps mounted on the rear differential of the truck in front. The drivers call them cat eyes. They're the only lights permitted. A driver who switches on his headlights risks bringing down German night fighters on the entire column. So the convoy feels its way through the French darkness. 40 trucks, 200 tons of cargo, gasoline and artillery shells and rations and medical supplies, moving toward an army that is consuming all of it faster than anyone believed possible. In the cab of the 7th truck, Private James Ruckert, 19 years old, from Cleveland, Ohio, grips the wheel and stares at the two faint red points of light ahead of him. He has been driving for 14 hours. His co-driver is asleep against the door. Ruckert's hands ache. His eyes burn. The truck smells of gasoline from the 5-gallon cans stacked behind the cab, 280 of them, 1,400 gallons of fuel for General Patton's Third Army, which is somewhere out ahead in the dark, racing toward the German border, sending back daily messages that say the same thing in increasingly desperate language: send gasoline, send more gasoline, send all the gasoline. Ruckert is one of approximately 23,000 men driving the Red Ball Express. 3/4 of them are, like him, African-American soldiers in a segregated army that did not believe they were capable of fighting. The army has assigned them to drive trucks instead. And in the late summer and autumn of 1944, the trucks they are driving have become the single most important supply operation in the European war. The German army cannot stop it. The Luftwaffe cannot find it. The weather cannot slow it. It runs day and night, every day for 82 consecutive days, and it delivers the materials that allow the Allied armies to chase the Wehrmacht across France and up to the borders of the Reich itself. The men driving the trucks will receive almost no recognition for 50 years. The operation they are running will be largely forgotten by the popular history of the war, but the soldiers at the front know. Patton knows. Eisenhower knows. And the German generals, watching their own horse-drawn supply columns struggle through the wreckage of the French rail system, know better than anyone. The Red Ball Express was born out of a problem that the Allied planners had created for themselves. In the months before D-Day, Allied air forces had systematically destroyed the French railway network. The purpose was to prevent the Germans from moving reinforcements to Normandy after the invasion. The campaign worked. The French railways, by June of 1944, were wreckage. Bridges were down, marshalling yards were cratered, locomotives were burned. The German divisions that tried to move toward Normandy in June and July came by road, slowly, under constant air attack, and arrived late and damaged. The plan had succeeded completely. The problem was that when the Allied armies broke out of Normandy at the end of July and began to race east, they needed the same railways that they had just destroyed. The plan for the European campaign had assumed a methodical advance with pauses for consolidation. The planners had projected that Allied forces would reach the Seine River by D+120, 4 months after the invasion. Instead, Operation Cobra shattered the German front at the end of July. Patton's Third Army was activated on August 1st, and the German position in France collapsed in 4 weeks. The Allies reached the Seine by D+79, 6 weeks ahead of schedule. Paris was liberated on August 25th. The armies kept moving east, and every mile they advanced stretched their supply lines another mile across a country whose railways the Allies themselves had destroyed, from ports that were either still in German hands or wrecked by German demolition. By the 3rd week of August, the situation had become a crisis. General Omar Brantley's 12th Army Group had 28 divisions advancing across France and Belgium. Each division required approximately 750 tons of supplies per day. Patton's Third Army alone was burning 800,000 gallons of gasoline per day. The supplies existed. They were stacked in enormous depots in Normandy, near the invasion beaches and the port of Cherbourg. But there was no way to move them east fast enough. The railways were destroyed. The pipelines were not yet built. The ports of Le Havre and Antwerp were still in German hands. The only thing available was trucks. The solution was improvised in a 36-hour brainstorming session on August 21, 1944, at a headquarters in Normandy. The officers of the Communications Zone, the Rear Area Logistics Command under General John C. H. Lee, working with the Motor Transport Service under Colonel Loren Ayers, sketched out a plan for a continuous loop conveyor belt of trucks running between the Normandy depots and the forward supply points. The concept borrowed its name from American railroad slang. Red ball was an old railroad expression for priority freight, fast freight that got the right-of-way over everything else on the line. The Army adopted the term, designed a route, and issued the orders. Red ball operations commenced on August 25, 1944, the same day Paris was liberated. The system was simple in concept and brutal in execution. Two parallel highway routes were closed to all other traffic, one carrying loaded trucks eastward, the other carrying empty trucks back west. The loop initially ran from Saint-Lô in Normandy to a forward depot area near Chartres, southwest of Paris. As the front advanced, the loop extended. By October, the eastern terminus had pushed out to points near the German border, with the route to 1st Army stretching nearly 400 miles and the route to 3rd Army 350 miles. Military police were stationed at every intersection along the entire route, around the clock, waving the convoys through so that no truck ever had to stop for cross-traffic. The route was marked with red ball signs, simple discs that gave the operation its visual identity. Civilian traffic was banned. French farmers learned to wait at crossings while the endless convoys rolled past. The trucks were to travel in convoys of at least 5 vehicles at 60-yard intervals at a maximum speed of 25 miles per hour. Those were the rules. The rules were broken constantly. Drivers, exhausted and under pressure to make their schedules, pushed their trucks to 40 and 50 miles per hour where the roads allowed. Convoy discipline frayed as the operation wore on. The military police wrote up violations, and the violations continued because the men at the front needed the cargo and the drivers knew it. The numbers of the Red Ball Express, when assembled in one place, describe an operation unlike anything in the previous history of military logistics. At its peak, the Express operated 5,958 vehicles, organized into 140 truck companies. On an average day, 900 loaded vehicles were on the route at any given moment, with a complete round trip taking 54 hours. On the peak single day, August 29, 1944, the Express moved 12,342 tons of supplies in a single 24-hour period. Across its 82 days of operation, from August 25 to November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express delivered 412,193 tons of gasoline, oil, lubricants, ammunition, food, and other essentials to the advancing armies. To move that tonnage, the Express consumed prodigious resources of its own. The trucks burned approximately 300,000 gallons of gasoline per day, which meant that a substantial fraction of the fuel being hauled east was consumed by the hauling itself. The trucks wore out tires at a rate that threatened to exhaust the entire European theater tire reserve. The engines, transmissions, and clutches of the GMC trucks, designed for a service life measured in tens of thousands of miles under normal use, were being consumed at several times the normal rate by continuous maximum load operation on damaged roads. Ordnance maintenance companies worked around the clock at depots along the route, swapping engines, replacing clutches, rebuilding transmissions, patching tires. Approximately 1 truck in 10 was out of service for maintenance at any given time. The operation ate trucks the way the front ate ammunition. The Army kept feeding it trucks because there was no alternative. The vehicle that made the Red Ball Express possible was the GMC CCKW 2.5-ton 6x6 cargo truck, known universally to American soldiers as the Jimmy or as the Deuce and a Half. The CCKW was the standard American medium cargo truck of the war. General Motors built over 560,000 of them between 1941 and 1945 at plants in Pontiac, Michigan and St. Louis, Missouri. The truck had a 6-cylinder gasoline engine producing 91 horsepower, a 5-speed transmission, a 2-speed transfer case, and driven axles front and rear, 6 wheels driving in total, which gave it the ability to keep moving through mud, sand, and shell-damaged road surfaces that would have stopped a conventional road truck. The CCKW was not a sophisticated vehicle. It was crude, loud, rough riding, and demanding of its drivers. The steering was heavy. The brakes required strong legs. The unsynchronized lower gears required double clutching, a skill that the hastily trained Red Ball drivers had to learn on the job. But the truck was nearly indestructible, easy to repair, and available in enormous numbers. It carried 2.5 tons rated, and the Red Ball drivers routinely loaded it with 5 tons, double the rating, because the front needed the cargo and the trucks could take it. The overloading shortened the truck's lives and increased the maintenance burden, and the operation continued anyway, because tonnage delivered was the only metric that mattered. The deuce-and-a-half became, in the decades after the war, one of those pieces of equipment that veterans remembered with a strange affection. It had no glamour, it appeared in no recruiting posters, but the men who drove it across France in 1944 understood what it was. It was the machine that moved the war. The German army, whose own transport was approximately 80% horse-drawn even in 1944, had nothing remotely equivalent. The Wehrmacht's horses consumed fodder that itself had to be transported, moved at walking pace, and died by the hundreds of thousands. The American Army's trucks consumed gasoline that America had in unlimited quantities, moved at 25 to 50 miles per hour, and were replaced from factory production when they wore out. The mobility gap between the two armies was, at bottom, the gap between the horse and the jimmy. The drivers of the Red Ball Express were, in their great majority, African-American soldiers. Approximately 75% of the Red Ball's drivers were black, drawn from the segregated quartermaster truck companies that the Army had created as part of its policy of excluding African-American soldiers from combat roles. The policy rested on a belief, widespread among the Army's senior leadership in the 1940s and refuted by every actual combat record available to them, that black soldiers lacked the courage and capability for frontline fighting. The Army therefore assigned the majority of its African-American personnel to service and supply units. By the autumn of 1944, 210,209 African-American soldiers were serving in the European theater, and 93,292 of them were in the Quartermaster Corps. The irony of the assignment was not lost on the men themselves. They had been classified as unfit for combat and then sent to drive unarmored trucks loaded with gasoline and ammunition through territory where German aircraft, artillery, and bypassed infantry units remained active. The Red Ball route was not a safe rear area. German fighter bombers strafed the convoys when weather and Allied air cover permitted. German artillery interdicted sections of the route within range of the front. Isolated German units, cut off by the speed of the Allied advance, ambushed trucks on secondary roads. Drivers were killed. Trucks were destroyed. The men drove on. They were combat soldiers in everything but designation, hauling the most flammable and explosive cargo in the theater, without armor, often without escort, frequently at night, always exhausted. Private James Rookert, the 19-year-old from Cleveland, drove the route for the entire life of the operation. He described the night driving years later. The cat-eye blackout lamps illuminated almost nothing. The drivers felt their way down the road, navigating by the dim red points of the truck ahead, by the sound of their own tires on the pavement, by memory of routes they had driven before. If you turned on your headlights, Rookert said, the Germans could bomb the whole convoy, so we had to feel our way down the road. Drivers fell asleep at the wheel. Trucks ran off the road, overturned, collided. Fatigue killed more Red Ball drivers than the Germans did. The operation's tempo did not permit adequate rest. Two-man driver teams traded the wheel back and forth, one man sleeping against the door while the other drove, swapping every few hours, around the clock, for days at a stretch. The segregation that had put the black drivers behind the wheel followed them onto the road. White and black truck companies operated on the same routes, hauled the same cargo, took the same risks, and were instructed not to mingle during off-duty hours. Washington Rector, a driver with the 39 16th Quartermaster Truck Company, recalled the standing instruction decades later. "You accepted discrimination," he said. "We were warned not to fraternize with whites for fear problems would arise." The races were kept sufficiently separate that some white veterans of the Express remained unaware, even decades after the war, that the majority of the men they had served alongside were African American. One white Red Ball veteran, a man named Emmerich, recalled telling a fellow soldier after the war that he had driven the Red Ball. The soldier looked at him in disbelief and asked why he was not black. There were incidents. One veteran remembered an African American unit attempting to pass a convoy of white drivers on the open highway. A game of chicken developed, with the white drivers swerving their trucks and trailers into the center of the road to prevent the black drivers from getting by. The episode ended without deaths, but it was remembered by the men who witnessed it as a compressed image of the contradiction they were living inside. They were carrying the lifeblood of a war against a regime built on racial ideology, for an army that subjected them to racial segregation, through a country that treated them, in many cases, with more equality than their own army did. French civilians along the route, who had no tradition of American-style segregation, welcomed the black drivers into their cafes and homes in ways that astonished men who had grown up under Jim Crow. Some of those men would carry the memory of that French welcome back to the United States after the war, where it would become part of the lived experience that fed the post-war civil rights movement. Most of the Red Ball drivers had never driven a truck before the war. The emergency that created the Express also created its workforce by reassignment and improvisation. When the operation was stood up in late August, the existing quartermaster truck companies were nowhere near sufficient to man it. The Army combed the rear areas for bodies. Infantry replacements awaiting assignment were handed over to the Motor Transport Service. Anti-aircraft crews whose guns had become redundant as the Luftwaffe vanished from French skies were converted to driver duty. Clerks, cooks, bandsmen, and engineers found themselves behind the wheel of a CCKW with a few hours of instruction and a route map. Most of the men were under 24 years old. Many had grown up in households that had never owned an automobile. They learned to double-clutch an unsynchronized military transmission on the job, at night, in convoy, loaded with gasoline. The training, where it existed at all, was compressed into days. A veteran driver would take a new man around a depot circuit a few times, demonstrate the gear shift pattern, explain the convoy interval rules and the blackout discipline, and then the new man was driving the route. The results were what anyone would predict: burned-out clutches by the hundreds, stripped gears, trucks ditched on the soft shoulders of French secondary roads. The maintenance companies cursed the green drivers and rebuilt what they broke, and the green drivers became experienced drivers within weeks because the route itself was the training. A man who had driven the St. Lo Loop a dozen times by day and night, in rain and traffic, had received an education in heavy trucking that no peacetime course could match. By October, the Red Ball workforce had hardened into a core of professional military truckers, men who could coax an overloaded deuce-and-a-half through a shell-cratered village in total darkness and arrive on schedule. They had been made, not recruited, and the making had cost the Army a fortune in clutches. The trucks were only half the system. The other half was the depots at either end of the loop, where the cargo was transferred, and these were operations of industrial scale in their own right. At the Normandy end, the supply dumps near Saint-Lô and the beaches held mountains of materiel that had been landed across the invasion beaches and through the port of Cherbourg. Jerrycans of gasoline were stacked in fields by the 100,000. Artillery ammunition sat in roadside dumps that stretched for miles. Rations, tires, signal wire, medical stores, and every other category of military supply waited in open-air storage under camouflage netting. The loading crews, themselves largely African-American quartermaster soldiers, worked in continuous shifts, filling each arriving truck by hand. A 1,400-gallon gasoline load meant 280 jerrycans passed hand-to-hand from the stack to the truck bed, 40 pounds at a time. A strong, practiced crew could load a truck in under 30 minutes. The trucks arrived in unbroken streams, around the clock, and the crews loaded them as they came. At the forward end, the process ran in reverse, complicated by the fact that the forward depots kept moving as the front advanced. A transfer point established near Chartres in August was leapfrogged within weeks by new points near Soissons, then toward Verdun and Liège as the armies approached the German frontier. Each move meant new dumps to be laid out, new road nets to be marked, new military police postings, new unloading details. The receiving crews broke the truckloads down for distribution to the Army's own supply columns, which carried the material the final miles to the divisions. The handoff was perpetual, and perpetually under pressure, because the Army's demands arrived faster than the tonnage, and every officer at every transfer point spent his days being shouted at by representatives of units that needed more than they were getting. The system never satisfied the demand. It merely kept the demand from becoming a catastrophe, which was the most that anyone could have asked of it. The cargo the Red Ball carried was dominated by fuel. Patton's Third Army, in the high-tempo weeks of late August and early September, consumed gasoline at rates that exceeded anything in the pre-war planning manuals. The 800,000 gallons per day that Third Army burned was matched by comparable consumption in First Army to the north. The two armies together required more than 1.5 million gallons of gasoline daily, all of it delivered by road, most of it in the 5-gallon jerrycans that had become the universal container of Allied fuel logistics. A single CCKW could carry approximately 280 jerrycans, 1,400 gallons. Moving a single day's fuel consumption for the two armies required over 1,000 truckloads every day before a single round of ammunition or ration crate was counted. The ammunition came second. Artillery ammunition was the heaviest single category, with each 105mm howitzer round weighing approximately 42 pounds in its packing, and the divisions firing thousands of rounds per day during active operations. Rations came third. The armies ate approximately 600 tons of food per day. Medical supplies, spare parts, signal equipment, engineering stores, and the 1,000 other categories of military consumption filled out the loads. The Red Ball hauled all of it. The loading crews at the Normandy depots worked in shifts around the clock, filling trucks as fast as they arrived. The unloading crews at the forward depots did the same in reverse. The trucks themselves never stopped for long. The system was designed to keep the vehicles rolling because a parked truck was wasted capacity, and there was no capacity to waste. The German response to the Red Ball Express was, for practical purposes, non-existent, and the reasons why illuminate the condition of the German war machine in the autumn of 1944. The Luftwaffe, which in 1940 would have made short work of an unarmored truck convoy system operating in daylight on predictable routes, had been driven from the skies of France. Allied fighter cover was continuous. German aircraft that attempted to interdict the supply routes were intercepted before they reached them, or shot down over them, or deterred from approaching at all. The occasional German fighter bomber that broke through accomplished little. Strafing attacks destroyed individual trucks. The convoys absorbed the losses and kept rolling. There were over 5,000 vehicles in the system. The Luftwaffe of 1944 could not destroy trucks faster than American factories built them, and the Luftwaffe knew it. German artillery could reach the eastern ends of the route, near the front lines, and did. Sections of road within range of German guns were driven at speed, at increased intervals, sometimes at night only. Drivers learned which stretches were dangerous. The military police rerouted convoys around active interdiction. The losses continued at a low level and never threatened the operation. German ground forces bypassed units and stay-behind parties, occasionally ambushed trucks on the secondary roads. The drivers, who were issued rifles and carbines but had little training in their use, fought back as best they could. Some were killed, some were captured. The convoys kept rolling. The deeper German failure was strategic. The Wehrmacht's own logistics doctrine had never seriously contemplated an enemy who could improvise a 400-mile truck supply line in 4 days and operate it at 12,000 tons per day. German planners, whose own army moved by rail and horse, assumed that any army outrunning its railheads would be forced to halt. By that assumption, the Allied advance should have stopped at the Seine. The Red Ball Express was the reason it did not stop. Patton reached the Meuse. First Army reached the German border. The pursuit ran for 300 miles past the point where German doctrine said it must end. The German generals, interrogated after the war, repeatedly identified Allied logistics as the decisive factor they had been unable to match or counter. They had been beaten, they said, not only by Allied armies, but by the trucks behind them. The Red Ball Express ran on the destruction of its own equipment and the exhaustion of its own men. The trucks, overloaded and driven continuously, consumed themselves. Engines that should have lasted years lasted months. Tires that should have run 20,000 miles lasted a fraction of that on the shell-pocked French roads. The ordnance maintenance system struggled to keep pace. At the peak of the operation, the European theater was consuming spare truck parts faster than the shipping pipeline could deliver them, and maintenance officers were cannibalizing wrecked vehicles for parts to keep others running. The Army calculated after the war that the Red Ball operation had effectively consumed the service life of approximately 40,000 trucks in under 3 months. The human cost was quieter and harder to count. Drivers worked shifts that would be illegal in any civilian context. Accidents were continuous. Trucks overturned on curves taken too fast by men too tired to judge speed. Convoys collided in the blackout. Vehicles ran off bridges. Men were crushed during loading, burned in fuel fires, killed in strafing attacks. The operation's casualty records were folded into general theater statistics rather than tabulated separately, which is one of the several reasons the Red Ball's story remained obscure for decades. The men themselves, returning to a segregated America after the war, found that their service was unknown and uncelebrated. The combat divisions had their histories, their reunions, their memorials. The truck companies had nothing. The drivers went home, took civilian jobs, and for the most part did not talk about the war because nobody asked. The fighting generals knew what they owed the trucks. George Patton, whose Third Army had been the principal consumer of the Red Ball's deliveries, said it directly. "The 2.5-ton truck," he said, "was our most valuable weapon." From Patton, a cavalry officer who had built his career and his legend on tanks, the statement was a remarkable concession. The tanks had made the headlines. The trucks had made the tanks possible. Eisenhower made the same point in his post-war writing, listing the Deuce-and-a-Half among the pieces of equipment that had won the war, alongside the C-47 transport, the Jeep, and the bulldozer. None of the 4 was a weapon. All of them were logistics. The Supreme Commander, looking back at the campaign, identified the carrying and the moving and the building, not the shooting, as the decisive American contributions. The judgment was correct, and the Red Ball Express was its sharpest illustration. The Allied armies of late 1944 did not outfight the Wehrmacht in any consistent tactical sense. German units, division for division, remained formidable to the end. What the Allies did was outsupply them. The American riflemen attacked with full ammunition pouches, artillery support that never ran short of shells, hot rations, fuel for every vehicle, and replacement equipment on demand. The German soldier opposite him counted rounds, rode horses, and walked. The difference was the trucks and the men driving them. The Red Ball Express was officially terminated on November 16, 1944, after 82 days of continuous operation. The reason was not failure, but success elsewhere in the logistics system. The port of Antwerp had been captured, and its approaches were being cleared. The French railways were being rebuilt by American engineer units at extraordinary speed, with the first through trains running to the forward areas by late autumn. Pipelines were coming into service for bulk fuel. The emergency that had created the Red Ball had passed, and the trucking system that had filled the gap was stood down, its companies redistributed to successor operations with new names. The White Ball route ran from Le Havre. The ABC route ran from Antwerp. The Yellow Diamond and the Lions Express and the others followed. The trucking continued to the end of the war. The name Red Ball and the 82 days behind it passed into the Army's institutional memory. The final accounting credited the Express with 412,193 tons delivered. The figure understates the achievement because the tonnage was delivered during the precise weeks when delivery mattered most, when the German army in the West was broken and running, when every ton moved forward translated directly into miles of liberated France, when a pause in the Allied advance would have given the Wehrmacht the time it desperately needed to rebuild a defensive line. The Germans got that pause anyway in late September, when even the Red Ball could not fully close the gap between the ports and the front, and the Allied advance halted on the German border for want of supply. The pause lengthened the war into 1945. Military historians have debated ever since whether a better prepared logistics system could have ended the war in 1944. The debate is unresolvable. What is not debatable is that without the Red Ball, the front would have stopped at the Seine in August, and the war would have been longer still. For decades after 1945, the Red Ball Express existed in American memory mainly as a name when it existed at all. A Hollywood film in 1952, starring Jeff Chandler and a young Sidney Poitier, dramatized the operation but softened its racial realities to suit the sensibilities of the studio era. The veterans themselves aged in obscurity. The Army's official histories recorded the statistics. The popular histories of the war, organized around battles and generals, had little space for truck schedules. The specific contribution of the African American drivers, 3/4 of the force, went almost entirely unacknowledged in the broader culture, a casualty of the same attitudes that had assigned them to the trucks in the first place. The correction began slowly in the 1990s as historians of the African American military experience documented the quartermaster unit's war, and as the surviving drivers, by then in their 70s, began to be interviewed and honored. David Cawley's book, The Road to Victory, published in 2000, brought the full story to a general audience. Surviving drivers were invited to Pentagon ceremonies. James Rookard, the Cleveland teenager of 1944, lived to see his service celebrated by the Army that had once segregated him. The recognition was real, and late, and incomplete, because most of the men who had driven the route were dead before it arrived. The Army's modern transportation units adopted the Red Ball name and insignia for exercises and operations, a quiet institutional acknowledgement that the 82 days of 1944 had become part of the service's founding mythology. The Red Ball Express compresses into a single operation the entire industrial logic of the Allied victory. It was improvised in 36 hours because American organizational culture permitted improvisation at scale. It was equipped with nearly 6,000 identical trucks because American industry had built vehicles in numbers no other economy could approach. It was fueled without constraint because American refineries produced gasoline in quantities the Axis could not imagine. It was manned by soldiers the Army had wrongly judged unfit for combat, who then performed one of the most demanding sustained operations of the war. And it was unstoppable, not because it was defended, but because the enemy's capacity to interdict it had already been destroyed by the cumulative weight of Allied air and industrial superiority. The German Army of 1944 was, in tactical craft, the equal of any force on Earth. It lost because the contest had ceased to be tactical. The contest had become a comparison of systems, and the German system, brilliant at the point of the spear, was medieval behind it. Horses hauled the Wehrmacht's shells, trucks hauled America's. The horse-drawn army could not retreat fast enough to escape the truck-supplied one. That asymmetry, played out across France in the autumn of 1944, is the whole story of the campaign, and the Red Ball Express is its purest expression. In a war decided by what kept moving was the convoy. 6,000 trucks on a one-way loop through France, 60 yards apart, 25 miles an hour, day and night, in rain and blackout, for 82 days without a pause. 412,000 tons. A complete round trip every 54 hours. A loaded vehicle passing any given point on the route every few seconds, around the clock for nearly 3 months. The German Wehrmacht had no answer to it. The Luftwaffe could not reach it. The weather could not stop it. The only thing that ever slowed the Red Ball Express was the exhaustion of its own men and the wearing out of its own machines, and the army fed it new men and new machines until the railways could take the load. The men who drove it were mostly young, mostly black, mostly unknown then and now. They had been told they were not fit to fight, and they answered by carrying the fight on their backs, 1,400 gallons at a time, through the dark behind 2 small red lights called cat eyes. Private James Rookhard of Cleveland, 19 years old, gripping the wheel south of Chartres at 11 o'clock at night, was not in the popular history's picture of the war. He was underneath the picture, holding it up. Every tank that rolled toward Germany, every shell that fell on a German position, every ration eaten by an American rifleman in the autumn of 1944 had ridden somewhere along its journey in the back of a deuce-and-a-half driven by a man like him. Patton called the truck his most valuable weapon. Eisenhower listed it among the machines that won the war. The German generals, in their post-war interrogations, pointed at the Allied supply system as the thing they could never match and never counter. They were all describing the same 82 days, the same roads, the same trucks, the same tired men feeling their way through the French night. In a war fought between systems, the system that could improvise 6,000 trucks into a conveyor belt in 4 days was the system that won. The Red Ball Express was the proof. Germany could not stop it, because stopping it would have required matching it, and matching it would have required being a different country. The trucks rolled until the job was done. Then the name was retired, the drivers went home unthanked, and the war they had carried moved on without them, into Germany. The recognition came 50 years late. The victory came on time. The men behind the cat eyes delivered it, 1,400 gallons at a time, and asked for nothing, and received almost exactly that, and won the war anyway.